Hi, we continue in Genesis 24 today. After Abraham's servant has completed his speech, trying to persuade Rebekah's family to send her off with him back to the old country to be the wife of his master's servant Isaac. And so we reach verse 50 here. As Laban and Bethuel, her brother and her father, we could ask, where's her mother Milcah, answer. And already, before we get any further into it, this is one of those many places where scholars divide on whether we should read this as a pastiche of various sources or narratively as a complete unit. As my note below has, highlighting both elements, Westerman, an older scholar, says this seems an obvious addition since the whole story is based on Rebekah's relationship with Laban, her brother, and Bethuel is here appearing as if in one voice with Laban and doesn't otherwise speak. But more recently, Menachem Perry, who teaches literature and reads from a narrative standpoint, says this is on the basis of the father's house and mother's house distinction, as we saw earlier, that she had said that she would bring them back to the mother's house, but the servant had asked about the father's house, and that the house would have two ends, a mother's house end and a father's house end, with only Laban going back and forth between the two. We can't answer that definitively, but here's Bethuel in the story, and we might wonder where's Milcah in the story? Because as you see on the right side of the screen, she had said, I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, her grandmother, whom she bore to Nahor. And then that's repeated here when the servant recites what she had said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. So we wonder about that, both where's grandma, but also where's her mother? Milcah's her grandmother, so where's her mother? And we just don't know. So there are elements of the story we don't know. And that's all we can do. But they answer as one voice and say the thing, or literally the word, comes from Yahweh. But then they add, we cannot speak to you anything bad or good. So are they for this or aren't they? They reach the conclusion that it comes from Yahweh, who's not their God, who's plainly the God of the servant's master. But then they add this ambiguous thing, we cannot speak to you good or bad. As Perry adds, it is as if they are saying, we cannot say yes and we cannot say no. Who are we in comparison with such a decisive word from your master's God? So they're not giving approval and they're not giving resistance. And the Midrash plays with that a lot, as we'll see as we go. So they continue here. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as Yahweh has spoken. Westerman notes this as a solemn traditional formula which determines the surrender of the daughter into another family union, beginning with what's translated look or of henna, as we've seen, behold. But I've not found that it's a solemn traditional formula anywhere else. So Westerman has not really provided any evidence I'm aware of this particular phrase is a traditional formula. But in any event, it does certainly seem to be implying that, but it doesn't actually imply that, as we'll see. They're not nearly ready to take her and go. And perhaps that's partly like what we saw in chapter 23, which ought to be fresh in our mind, when the Hittites, and especially Ephron, made it sound like we're going to give you the land, but Abraham said, no, please listen to me, because he could see through it. So having prepared for how Hittites talk at the polite level and maybe have politics and prophets underneath, there's perhaps politics and prophets underneath here, and we'll see some of how that might play out in a minute as we compare the question of how this might sound to a post-exilic audience listening to texts such as 2nd Isaiah or Ezra and Nehemiah, but we'll get to that in just a minute. So he says, look, Rebekah is before you, take her and go. And that's where I want to bring the question up here. Is this parallel to people leaving Mesopotamia from exile, as well as from the point of our story here? Because as we've seen, this is where they were up here in Haran, and that was the point where the text told us back in chapter 11 and 12 that the three brothers' father, Terah, had taken them to this point, and that's the point where Abram had his vision that led him to go all the way down to here. So taking this trip from here is the same trip that Abram took, and perhaps similar to the trip that the exiles would take, although they may have been here and they may have been all the way down here in Ur, or in fact in Babylon itself, as far as we know. So I'm going to put up the question of, no, I won't do that quite yet. We'll get to that in just a minute. So we've completed this part, so we don't need to be doing that anymore, but I just want to keep that in mind if you haven't watched the previous videos, so we can see the process by which the servant convinced them, changing his message from what we had heard the first round. So returning back to our key words here, and one thing that's a key word in this section here that I didn't highlight because it's really only a key word in this section is the verb for return or send back. And we see it here, send me back that she might go let the girl remain with us, or no, will you go with this man, and all these questions about going. And that's what I think evokes the question of whether they get stuck in exile in Babylon. But we'll get to that in just a minute. So when Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the ground before Yahweh and then brought up the jewelry. As Westerman notes below, the servant reacts with two gestures. He bows down and distributes presents. There's a particular subtlety here in that the act of thanks consists only in the gesture. It is a real present and not a bride price. And the Midrash agrees on that completely. That what the gifts he brings out here, he's not buying her. He's not paying the family for it. In fact, if anything, as we'll see in a minute, their suggestion of a long delay might be to raise a dowry on their own part. But this is not, he's not buying her. This is purely a gift. But when he brings us out, we need to make a comparison. And my note here has from Deuteronomy, to the extent that's relevant to the audience, not to the characters in the story, there's a 50 shekel limit on the bride price. We're not told the actual value of these things in shekels, but it certainly seems like it may be more than that. So it's described generically. He brought a jewelry of silver and of gold, using the word kili here first here, and it can be used generically for objects. It doesn't have to be jewelry. Valuable objects of silver and gold. Notice the difference between the specifics of the nose ring and the bracelets earlier. And garments, and the word beged here is for festal garments, not just any clothing. We'll see it a couple times later, especially in chapter 37, when it comes around Joseph's famous coat. And also he gave, curiously, check this out, to his brother and her mother costly garments, not to her father and not to her grandmother, who we've heard so many times. Why is that? The Midrash is divided here. Some say the father died between the two events. Others that the father refused the gifts from a slave, that it was beneath his dignity to receive gifts from a slave. But of course they're simply speculating there. And the word for what they give to them here, the costly ornaments, migdanoth, is only in Ezra 1:6 and these couple places in Chronicles, corresponding to Akkadian, Turcatum, and Biblium, gifts and bride price, according to Sarna. But more recently, the Jewish scholar Barr notes the term is always associated with silver and gold, who concludes that it refers to fruit as an expression of divine bounty. And medieval commentator Rashi agreed, following in the Song of Songs from in the English version 713, where it's translated as fruit. And that will be an interesting element, as we'll see. So that brings up the question of the comparison between this passage and these from post-exilic texts. So let's start with the one we're on here, the use of migdanoth given to her brother Rebekah. And then we see in the very first chapter of Ezra, right after King Cyrus of Persia has claimed that Yahweh has given him power, it says, all their neighbors aided them, which is to say the exiles in Babylon, with silver vessels, with gold, with goods, with animals, and valuable gifts, migdanoth, besides all that was freely offered. And then we see what follows here, not directly in the next verse, but in the few verses after, is the names of the people going from Mesopotamia to Judah/Jerusalem. It's not Jerusalem in our story, but it's Jerusalem in the Ezra story that's going to be rebuilt. As we'll see, with the naming of Rebekah and her nurse and her maids. They're not named specifically, but the fact that her nurse is named as a nurse and the maids are named as maids is more specific than what we've heard. For example, the servants' men are simply described as men. They're not given any particular roles. In Ezra, similarly, after the gifts of jewelry, it's followed by the names of people who are the exiles, who, within the arrangement that Ezra, the priest scribe, and Nehemiah, the Persian appointed governor, who'd been the imperial cupbearer for the Persian king, arrange, is that the list of people there, the only people who will be part of the official families approved by Persia. So the Ezra-Nehemiah lineage will provide a very narrow circumspect arrangement and will include the banning of marriages and children that are from foreigners, but especially of Canaanites. Here, though, it's a marriage between a Mesopotamian and whatever it is Isaac is. He's not an Israelite yet, because Israel is literally going to be one of his sons, Jacob, who becomes also named Israel. So they're not Mesopotamians anymore. They're certainly not Jews. They're in this in-between space, but it's certainly setting up that parallel. And anticipating what we're going to see here, that key word that I was noting in the Hebrew shlach, it's hard to pronounce without vowels, to send me back 3 times there in this little passage. And then we hear it in Isaiah 45, specifically around the question of Cyrus. Set my exiles free, that in Yahweh's voice there. And then also around this word successful, that we saw was a key word, where the servant talked about making his journey successful, and that Yahweh has done that. And now here, Yahweh speaking about Cyrus, I have brought him and he will prosper, or made successful, the same word. And similarly in Nehemiah, Nehemiah says, give success in a prayer to your servant today and grant him mercy at the sight of this man. And at that time he knows I was cupbearer to the king. So what we're seeing here potentially are two different forms of returning to the land. Just as chapter 23 was suggesting two different forms of acquiring the land, the version, what I call the religion of empire texts, especially texts like Joshua and Judges, that in the name of Yahweh engage in holy war, harem in the Hebrew, to destroy all the peoples of the land, or so they can acquire it, so the Israelites can acquire it, or according to Genesis, so you negotiate a purchase agreement with the locals, and it's peaceful, and although you may be taken advantage of economically, if the money's there, then you can purchase some of the land. So those are two possibilities in contrast to the question of war, or in the context of the Ezra and Nehemiah of making an alliance with empire, exactly what prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah said was the problem that led to exile in the first place. So just a couple of examples of how Genesis may be playing this out against the background of the options in the exilic situation and post-exilic situation of what had become the dominant text. So we continue down here. So with the giving of the gifts, then we hear something interesting. He and the men who were with him ate and drank by themselves. It doesn't say that there's a big family gathering, and that's really quite an omission here. You would think at this point they would all be eating together, that Laban and Rebekah and the mother and father and the whole family, and maybe even the neighbors and all the city people would be having a big departure celebration and a celebration of the impending wedding. But it simply says he and the men were with him ate and drank. And they spent the night together, which is a dark echo that doesn't manifest here. The spending the night echoes what the servants of Yahweh, who are also angels, messengers, said to Lot in 19:2. They would spend the night in the square, and Lot convinced him not to. And so that raises, again, the question of the hospitality of city people. But nothing happens here. There's nothing about the people of Nahor, of Haran rather, the city of Haran, the city of Nahor, but the town is named Haran, that suggests that the people are objecting here. Whether it's because they see that Laban, unlike Lot, actually is a hometown boy, he's not a resident alien as they accuse Lot of being, or because they see the wealth and they think some of that may come to them, we simply don't know. But when they arose in the morning, he said, send me back to my master. Notice again, not send us back to my master, but send me, as if it's just him, when plainly it's not going to be. As Wenham notes below, the man who has shown himself such a charming diplomat is here quite blunt. And indeed he is, and he needs to be, because he will not get as simple an answer, and we hear it right here. Her brother and her mother said, again, notice now here we have the mother speaking, although really only Laban speaks. There's no other reference to Rebekah's mother other than this, and Bethuel is gone too. The Midrash and Rashi both claim that he was the father was opposed to the marriage, so an angel killed him, and others offer more possibilities. But the quote here is, let the girl, notice she's reverted to being the girl here. She'll be Rebekah, as we can see on the key words thing here several times. At this moment, they're talking about her own sister or their own daughter as simply the girl, the Na'arah, which she becomes again here, and here also. So let the girl remain with us a while, at least 10 days. But the figure of speech here in Hebrew, yamin of asor, although it literally means days rather 10, according to the Aramaic Targum, is translated a year or 10 months, suggesting to the Midrash the point I was making earlier, that they're suggesting she stay for a year so they can build up a dowry for her to take with them. But whether it's 10 days or a year, whether 10 days is a figure of speech for a while and not a literal 10 days, isn't clear, but plainly they're not letting her go right away. So now we see even more how this negotiation, as appearing as a negotiation, echoes what we saw in the last chapter. Was the servant watching his master do the negotiation for the cave in the field to learn from it? We don't know. He wasn't mentioned there. But now it's his turn. And he says to them, do not delay me, introducing a new word here. It's only 2 other times in Genesis, both related to wedding plans, as we'll see. Since Yahweh has made my journey successful. Notice again, it's my journey. He had said in the comparison, we can go back and look at that now, that I'm sorry, that's the wrong one here, and this one here, that it was a question of being successful for the master here. And we saw that earlier here in this passage, but now he reverts it back to being about whether he was successful. So let me go back to my master, again, as if it's him individually. But they insist on it being about the girl. As Wenham notes below, presumably Laban calculated that attachment to home and respect for her mother's opinion would surely make her ask for a delay. And I suggest that behind this, just as Sternberg helped us to hear the levels of politeness, politics, and prophets in chapter 23, a similar thing is here. We saw that Laban had shekels in his eyes when he saw the camels right away and described that as blessed of Yahweh. And he's already been given some presents, and we don't know how much more he can see on those 10 camels, but perhaps he's hoping that the servant can buy him off just a little more to get them out of there. But that's not, he doesn't ask for that directly because that would be too crude to ask for more presents. So he says instead, we will call the girl and ask her, which is the first moment we realize she's not there for this scene. And it would lead us to wonder, why isn't she there? If the servant and the men were eating and drinking and spent the night, and now in the morning the mother and brothers are having this conversation, why would she not be part of it? But we don't know, and they call her and ask her. And literally ask her mouth, a figure of speech apparently only here in the Hebrew Scripture. And it's this scene that leads the Midrash to say that the consent of a young woman is necessary for any marriage, and that this scene established that as a Jewish precedent. So we see here, from my note below, it suggests that the all-night consultation that might have led to this clarity of decision, given both the generous offer and radical change it would mean for Rebekah. And as Perry notes, Rebekah is not asked, will you follow him to be a wife to his master's son, but only, will you go with this man, as if he himself is the bridegroom. And Perry's been making that argument throughout the whole chapter, and it certainly would have been true before they came to the house, before he had mentioned that he was on the mission of finding a wife for his master's son. But at this point, she knows that, doesn't she? And so I'm not sure I can see that Perry's point is still the case when she's already been told, and the family's been told, that the journey is not for his own getting a wife, but for his master's son. And now it switches from calling him the Nahara or the Alma, as we saw last time, the even more kind of poignant name for a marriage-eligible young girl. But now she's Rebekah, Rebekah, Rebekah. And so they called Rebekah. Notice the narrator calls her Rebekah while they called her the girl. They called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? And she answers in one word, Elek, echoing what Abram was called to do, Lek Lekah, to get up and go from the same place. So as some scholars have noted, really she's more the one that follows in Abraham than Isaac. Isaac will not have any kind of journey like this, and as we'll see in the next video at the end of the chapter, he'll just be waiting there passively for her to arrive. So it's Rebekah really who's the continuation of the lineage. So as we're almost done here, they sent away their sister. And notice now all the different things she's called. She's been called a young woman and an marriage-eligible young girl, an Alma, and by name, and now their sister. But their sister? The only sibling named is Laban. And that brings us back to the continuing confusion of what we saw early on, because we saw Bethuel become the father of Rebekah, but also there's all these other siblings of Bethuel. Don't they have kids? Are there not more people in this family that would be in this area? Why are there not more of them? And yet they refer collectively to their sister Rebekah, when plainly Laban is the only one described here as an immediate sister. But all of these would be. These are aunts and uncles, or uncles, I guess. But it's an interesting question of why there. And now her nurse, who's later, we're told in chapter 35, is Deborah when she dies, which is to highlight she's there all the way through the end of the Jacob cycle. By the time we get to chapter 35, it's really almost on the edge of the Joseph story. So Rebekah will take us all the way here from 24:59 to 35:8, along with Abraham's servant and his men. So now for the first time we hear they're all going, but that's not all of it. And they blessed. It's not clear exactly who the they is at this point. Is it the mother and Laban? Is it the mother and the father? We don't hear that. We just hear they here. As Westermann notes, the farewell blessing in its most ancient form, rhythmic in Hebrew, combining wishes for increase in victory. But again, he's reading in an old way, and it doesn't have to necessarily be that way. My note below, anticipating something we'll see later, noting that the blessing is ineffective and that Rebekah is barren until Isaac prays for her. But it's also the question of the human blessing. As we'll see when Isaac offers a blessing for Jacob that apparently is stolen from Esau, human blessings are mere words. The only entity that has the power to bless is Yahweh, which is to say, to make fertility actually happen. Humans can just wish that Yahweh can do something, but they don't have the immediate power to do that. So this is really just a wish, a farewell wish. It's not really in the same category of blessing that comes from Yahweh. But what they hear here is not necessarily the military victory that it seems like it is. Let's look at it a little more closely. They blessed Rebekah and said to her, "May you, our sister, become thousands of myriads." Notice how that's parallel to Yahweh's blessing for Abraham about your descendants being as numerous as the sand of the seashore or the stars of the sky, although no earth metaphor or sky metaphor is given here. "May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes." Almost verbatim from 22:17, right after the binding of Isaac. Let's go back and see that. This is Yahweh's voice, or Yahweh's angel's voice. "I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, as the sand of the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gates of their enemies." And so plainly that's connected. But in the Midrash, it's linked as a promise that people of wisdom and integrity would serve in the gate as judges. In other words, gaining possession of the gates does not mean that you would take over their cities by military force. It would mean the gate of the city is the place where justice takes place, as the prophets announced so many times. And so your offspring will be people of integrity who will be the ones in charge of the enemy's gates. In other words, they will bring God's justice to the places where there's injustice. Very different interpretation, all the way back to the Midrash. So our scene here ends in verse 61, and as Miguel de la Torre notes below, it is Rebekah, not her intended husband Isaac, who truly walks in Abraham's steps, following in his life experience of alienation. So now we hear about her maids, and notice they're not named specifically as Rachel's and Leah's will be in the next generation, but where is Deborah here? Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, which is certainly anachronistic in that time period. It didn't say the servant or the men had mounted the camels. They were carrying all the goods. And riding camels in the time period of the story is anachronistic. But it's obviously not about the time period of the story. It's about the time period of the audience in exile or after exile. So they mounted the camels and followed the man, and thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Notice from his perspective, the maids and Deborah irrelevant. His job is fulfilled, and he's on his way. So we'll see how this concludes next time, when Isaac, interestingly, takes his new woman into the tent of his wife, his mom, Sarah. We'll see that next time. See you then. Bye.